On the evening of March 14, 1958, Thomas Eugene McKinley pushed his janitor's cart through the gleaming marble corridors of the Federal Communications Commission building in Washington, District of Columbia, believing his biggest concern that night would be removing coffee stains from the deputy director's Persian rug. He had worked the night shift for 11 years, invisible to the lawyers and bureaucrats who filled these halls during daylight hours, content in his anonymity and the steady paycheck that supported his wife Martha and their 3 children in their modest home in Arlington, Virginia. What Thomas could not have known as he methodically emptied wastebaskets and polished brass door handles was that before sunrise, his routine observations would set in motion events that would expose one of the most damaging Soviet intelligence operations on American soil and forever alter the trajectory of Cold War counterintelligence. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Thomas McKinley had never aspired to greatness. Born in 1927 in rural Kentucky, he had grown up watching his father work the coal mines until black lung claimed him at age 42. Thomas had joined the army in 1945, just in time to participate in the occupation of Japan, where he learned that discipline and attention to detail could keep a man alive. After his discharge in 1948, he had moved to Washington with dreams of finding work that did not involve destroying his body underground. The federal custodial services offered steady employment, benefits, and a pension, things his father had never known. Thomas took the job without hesitation. The Federal Communications Commission building stood as a monument to post-war American bureaucracy, 7 stories of limestone and glass that housed hundreds of employees responsible for regulating the nation's airwaves and telecommunications infrastructure. In 1958, at the height of Cold War tensions, the work conducted within these walls had taken on heightened importance. The commissioners and their staff oversaw radio frequencies used by military installations, monitored international broadcasting, and coordinated with intelligence agencies on matters of signal security. It was sensitive work, though Thomas understood little of the technical details. He simply knew that certain floors required additional security clearance, that some offices were locked even at night, and that he was to report anything unusual to his supervisor, a former Marine named Donald Patterson. Thomas had developed his own rhythm over the years. He would arrive at precisely 9 o'clock in the evening, just as the last stragglers from the day shift were gathering their coats and briefcases. He would begin on the 7th floor and work his way down, systematically cleaning each office, conference room, and bathroom. The work was solitary and repetitive, which suited him fine. He would listen to the radio through a small earpiece, tuning in to baseball games during the season, or news broadcasts when the games were not playing. He had memorized the locations of light switches, the quirks of temperamental door locks, and the preferences of individual employees who left notes requesting special attention to their spaces. On that particular Thursday evening in March, Thomas noticed nothing unusual during his first 3 hours of work. The 7th floor yielded its typical collection of discarded memoranda, cigarette-filled ashtrays, and half-empty coffee cups. The 6th floor, home to the engineering division, was similarly unremarkable. It was not until he reached the 5th floor, where the international broadcasting section maintained its offices, that his routine was disrupted by a sound that did not belong. The 5th floor was typically silent at night. The employees in this section kept regular hours and rarely worked late. Thomas had just finished mopping the main corridor when he heard what sounded like a file cabinet drawer closing, the distinctive metallic thunk echoing from one of the offices near the eastern stairwell. He paused, mop in hand, listening. The building was old enough that it produced its own symphony of creaks and groans, and Thomas had learned to distinguish between the normal settling sounds and genuine disturbances. This sound was definitely the latter. He moved quietly down the corridor, his rubber-soled work shoes making no sound on the freshly mopped tile. The sound had come from Office 527, which belonged to Douglas Reeves, a mid-level analyst who specialized in Soviet broadcasting patterns. Thomas knew this because he had once found a classified document left on Reeves's desk and had properly reported it to Patterson, who had commended him for his diligence. The office door was closed but not locked, and a thin line of light showed beneath it. Thomas hesitated. His instructions were clear. If he encountered someone working late, he was to knock politely, ask if they needed anything, and move on. But something about this situation felt wrong. Reeves was a man of strict habits, who always left by 5:30 in the evening, something Thomas knew because he had cleaned this office at least 200 times and had never once encountered its occupant. The presence of someone in that office at nearly midnight struck him as sufficiently unusual to warrant caution. He knocked gently on the door. The light beneath it immediately went dark. Thomas felt his heartbeat accelerate. In 11 years of night custodial work, he had encountered his share of odd situations. Employees sleeping at their desks after working too late, office romances conducted after hours, even one memorable incident involving a deputy assistant director and a bottle of bourbon. But none of those situations had involved someone deliberately hiding from his knock. Thomas knocked again, louder this time, and identified himself. "Mr. Reeves, it is Thomas from Custodial Services. I saw your light on and wanted to check if you needed anything before I clean your office." Silence. Then the sound of papers rustling, followed by careful footsteps approaching the door. The door opened perhaps 4 inches, held by a security chain Thomas had not known existed in these offices. A man's face appeared in the gap, but it was not Douglas Reeves. Thomas recognized the face, though. It belonged to Viktor Konstantin Petrov, a translator in the Soviet Affairs Division, whose office was on the 3rd floor. The recognition must have shown on Thomas's face, because Petrov immediately forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Thomas, yes. Hello. I'm just retrieving some materials for Mr. Reeves. We are collaborating on a project." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind racing. Petrov's explanation was plausible enough. Interdepartmental cooperation was common, but several details troubled him. First, why would Petrov be working at midnight on a Thursday? Second, why had he turned off the lights when Thomas knocked? Third, and most troubling, Thomas had distinctly heard a file cabinet, and he knew from cleaning this office that Reeves kept his file cabinets locked at all times, a security requirement for offices handling classified materials. "I will come back later to clean," Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. "What time do you think you will be finished?" Petrov's smile tightened. "Oh, I am just leaving now. Please, give me 2 minutes to gather my things and the office is yours." The door closed. Thomas stood in the corridor, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. He heard more rustling inside, the click of a briefcase closing, the scrape of a chair being pushed back. He made a decision. Instead of waiting in the corridor, he moved quickly to the eastern stairwell, positioned himself where he could see the office door, but remain hidden in the shadows, and watched. Petrov emerged 3 minutes later carrying a leather briefcase that appeared substantially fuller than Thomas expected, for someone simply collecting collaborative materials. The translator looked both directions down the corridor, his movements furtive and quick. He did not go toward the main elevators. Instead, he moved to the eastern stairwell, the less used route that led directly to the parking garage. Thomas waited 30 seconds, then followed. He descended the stairs as quietly as possible, staying far enough behind that Petrov would not hear him, but close enough that he could track the man's progress. His heart was pounding now, and he recognized the familiar surge of adrenaline from his army days. He had no clear plan, no idea what he was actually witnessing, but his instincts told him this mattered. The eastern stairwell emptied into a side corridor that led to both the parking garage and a rarely used exit onto C Street. Thomas reached the bottom of the stairs in time to see Petrov pushing through the C Street exit, the briefcase clutched tightly to his chest. The translator did not go to the parking garage where legitimate employees would retrieve their vehicles. Instead, he walked quickly up C Street toward the metro station. Thomas stood at the exit, weighing his options. He could return to his work and report what he had seen to Patterson in the morning. That would be the safe choice, the reasonable choice. But the image of Petrov's nervous face, the full briefcase, the obvious deception, all of it suggested something that could not wait until morning. Thomas made his second decision of the night. He retrieved his coat from his custodial closet, left his cart in the corridor, and followed Petrov into the cold March night. Washington at midnight was a different city, than the bustling government center Thomas saw at the beginning of his shift. The streets were largely empty, the office buildings dark monuments against the night sky. Thomas stayed a full block behind Petrov, using his army training to move in shadows and behind parked cars. The translator walked with purpose, never looking back, clearly confident he had not been detected. Petrov did not go to the metro station. Instead, he continued north on 14th Street, walked east on G Street, and finally turned south on 11th Street. Thomas recognized the neighborhood. They were heading toward the warehouse district near the waterfront, an area that emptied out completely after the loading docks closed for the day. This was not a residential area. Nobody had any legitimate reason to be here at 1 o'clock in the morning. The streets were darker now, many of the streetlights broken or disabled. Thomas had to close the distance between himself and Petrov to avoid losing sight of his quarry. His breath made clouds in the cold air, and he became acutely aware that he was completely alone, following a possible spy through a deserted industrial area with no backup and no weapon. The thought occurred to him that this might be spectacularly foolish, but he had come too far to turn back now. Petrov stopped at a warehouse on Water Street, a 3-story brick structure that Thomas knew had been vacant for at least 2 years. The translator looked around carefully, scanning the street in both directions. Thomas pressed himself into the doorway of an adjacent building, holding his breath. Petrov produced a key from his pocket, unlocked a side door to the warehouse, and disappeared inside. Thomas counted to 60, then approached the door. It had closed but not locked, the latch not fully engaged. He pushed it open inch by careful inch, wincing at every small creak. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of shadows and abandoned equipment. Moonlight filtered through broken windows high in the walls, providing just enough illumination to navigate without flashlights. Thomas could hear voices somewhere deeper in the building, muffled but definitely present. He moved through the warehouse like a ghost, using pallets and old machinery as cover. The voices grew louder, and he could now distinguish 2 speakers. One was definitely Petrov, the other had a deeper voice with what sounded like a Russian accent, though Thomas could not be certain. He crept closer, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain they would hear it. Behind a tall stack of crates, Thomas finally found a position where he could see and hear clearly. Petrov stood in a cleared area near the center of the warehouse, illuminated by a single battery-powered lantern. Across from him stood a tall, thin man in his 50s, wearing an expensive overcoat. Between them, on a wooden table, lay Petrov's briefcase, now open and displaying what appeared to be stacks of documents. The older man was speaking in English with that distinctive accent Thomas had noted. "You have done well, Victor. These frequency allocations are exactly what Moscow needs. The Americans are so confident in their security that they discuss classified matters as if they are menu selections at a restaurant." Petrov looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with the briefcase clasps. "I took significant risks obtaining these, Dmitri. Reeves keeps everything locked. I had to pick his file cabinet, and the janitor nearly discovered me. The Americans are not as careless as you suggest." The man called Dmitri laughed, a cold sound that echoed in the empty space. "One janitor. You were frightened by a janitor. Victor, you are becoming paranoid. These American cleaning people, they see nothing. They understand nothing. They are invisible. They are no threat." Thomas felt anger flash through him at the casual dismissal, but he remained perfectly still. Dmitri was examining the documents now, holding pages up to the lantern light and nodding with satisfaction. "These will compromise American signal security in the Pacific Theater for months. The Directorate will be very pleased. Your payment has been arranged, 50,000 American dollars in the account we discussed." Petrov nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders at the mention of money. "When will I receive the next assignment?" "Soon. We have several high-priority targets in the Communications Commission. You have proven yourself valuable, but you must be more careful. No more late-night visits to other people's offices. Too much risk of detection. We will provide you with a camera. You will photograph materials in place and return them to the files. Much safer." Thomas had heard enough. He began to carefully retreat, moving slowly back through the maze of crates and machinery. He had to get out, get to a phone, contact someone who could act on this information. But who? The police? The FBI? He had no idea what the proper protocol was for discovering a Soviet spy, something he recognized as a significant gap in his life experience. He had almost reached the side door when his foot came down on something that rolled beneath his weight. He stumbled, caught himself on a metal shelf, but the damage was done. The shelf tipped, sending a cascade of old paint cans clattering to the concrete floor with a sound like thunder in the silent warehouse. Thomas ran. He crashed through the side door into the street, his lungs burning as he sprinted toward the brighter streets to the north. Behind him he heard shouts in Russian and the pounding of footsteps. They were coming after him. He rounded a corner, nearly slipping on the damp pavement, and forced his 50-year-old legs to move faster than they had in years. He could hear them gaining on him. Thomas knew these streets from his army days when he had briefly been stationed at the Washington Navy Yard. He took a hard left into an alley, vaulted over a chain-link fence with an agility that surprised him, and found himself in the loading area behind a closed restaurant. He pressed himself into the shadows behind a dumpster, controlling his breathing, listening. Footsteps approached, slowed. He heard Petrov's voice, tense and frightened. "I saw someone." There was definitely someone in the warehouse. Dmitri's response was sharp with anger. "Then we have a problem. If they heard anything, if they understood what they saw, we must assume the operation is compromised. You must disappear, Victor. Tonight, do not return to your apartment. Do not go to the office. Use the emergency protocols." The footsteps moved away, searching other directions. Thomas waited a full 10 minutes after the sounds faded before emerging from his hiding place. His hands were shaking, and he realized his entire body was trembling from adrenaline and cold. He had just witnessed an active espionage operation, a Soviet agent stealing American classified information. He had to report this, but he also had to be smart about it. If Petrov and this Dmitri realized someone could identify them, they would vanish before morning. Thomas found a payphone 6 blocks away, outside an all-night diner. The operator connected him to the FBI emergency line, and he explained as concisely as possible what he had witnessed. The agent who took the call seemed skeptical at first. Thomas could hear it in the man's voice, but something in Thomas's detailed description of events convinced him this was not a prank or the ravings of someone unstable. "Stay at the diner," the FBI agent instructed. "Agents will be there within 20 minutes. Do not talk to anyone about this. Do not use the phone again. Just order coffee and wait." Thomas did as instructed. He sat in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like motor oil, watching the empty streets outside. His mind replayed the scene in the warehouse over and over. The documents spread on the table. Dmitri's cold laugh. The casual dismissal of American custodial workers as invisible and insignificant. That last part bothered him more than it probably should have, but Thomas had spent his entire adult life being invisible, being dismissed as insignificant. Tonight, being invisible had given him the perfect cover to witness something extraordinary. The FBI agents arrived in 32 minutes, 2 men in dark suits who looked like they had been pulled out of bed and were not happy about it. They interviewed Thomas in the diner booth, taking extensive notes, asking him to repeat details multiple times. One agent, who introduced himself as Special Agent Richard Crawford, seemed particularly interested in Thomas's description of Dmitri. "Can you describe him again, everything you remember? Height, weight, age, any distinguishing features?" Thomas closed his eyes, picturing the scene. Tall, maybe 6 feet 1 or 2 inches. Thin build, probably 160 pounds. Age, I would estimate mid to late 50s. He had grey hair thinning on top. Expensive clothes. The overcoat looked like cashmere. No facial hair. His English was very good, but definitely accented. He called the other man Victor, and Victor called him Dmitri. Crawford exchanged a glance with his partner. "The description matches someone we have been watching. If this is who I think it is, you may have just given us our first solid evidence on a very dangerous individual." The FBI moved with impressive speed. By 3 o'clock in the morning, a team of agents was in the warehouse, photographing the scene and dusting for fingerprints. By 4 o'clock, they had Viktor Petrov in custody, arrested at his apartment in Georgetown just as he was preparing to flee. Dmitri, whose full name Thomas would later learn, was Dmitri Alexandrovich Volkov. A senior KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy was not arrested. Instead, the FBI placed him under intensive surveillance, hoping to identify other members of his network. Thomas was kept at FBI headquarters until dawn, providing statement after statement, working with a sketch artist to create a detailed drawing of Volkov, identifying Petrov from a photo array. Crawford told him that his testimony would likely be crucial in any prosecution of Petrov, and that he should expect to be called as a witness if the case went to trial. "You understand that your life has just become considerably more complicated," Crawford said, as the sun rose over Washington. "These are not people who take kindly to witnesses. We can offer you protection, but we cannot guarantee your safety or your family's safety if the Soviets decide you represent a threat." Thomas thought of Martha and the children sleeping peacefully in Arlington, unaware that their husband and father had just stumbled into the shadowy world of Cold War espionage. "What should I do?" he asked. Crawford was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, Mr. McKinley, I do not know. This situation is unprecedented. A civilian witness to an active espionage operation, someone with no security clearance or training. You did the right thing following Petrov and calling us. But you also put yourself in considerable danger. If Volkov had caught you in that warehouse, you would not have survived to make that phone call." The reality of how close he had come to death hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been operating on instinct and adrenaline, not thinking through the consequences. He remembered Dmitri's cold voice, the casual way he had discussed compromising American security. These were men who viewed people as tools or obstacles, nothing more. The FBI kept Thomas under protective surveillance for 3 weeks. 2 agents were assigned to watch his house, accompany him to and from work, and monitor his family's movements. Martha was terrified when she learned what had happened, oscillating between pride in her husband's courage and fury at the risks he had taken. The children, ages 9, 12, and 14, thought having FBI agents around was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to them. Viktor Petrov, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of execution for espionage, agreed to cooperate with American counterintelligence. His debriefing revealed a Soviet intelligence operation far more extensive than the FBI had suspected. Petrov had been recruited while working as a translator at the United Nations in New York in 1952. He had been cultivated carefully over several years before being activated as an agent in 1956. His handler, Dmitry Volkov, ran a network of at least 7 other agents in Washington, all of them positioned in government agencies with access to classified information. The documents Petrov had stolen from Douglas Reeves's office contained detailed information about radio frequencies used by American military installations throughout the Pacific Theater. The intelligence would have allowed the Soviet Union to intercept American military communications, potentially compromising operations in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. The damage, had the theft not been discovered, could have been catastrophic. Thomas was eventually called to testify before a closed session of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He sat in a windowless room in the Capitol building, surrounded by stern-faced congressmen, and recounted his story for what felt like the 100th time. Some of the congressmen seemed to view him as a hero. Others seemed suspicious of a mere janitor who had supposedly thwarted a Soviet espionage ring. One congressman from Texas openly questioned whether Thomas might himself be a Soviet agent, using this elaborate story as cover for his own activities. Crawford, who attended the hearing, bristled at the suggestion. "Mr. McKinley has been thoroughly vetted. His background is impeccable. He is a veteran, a family man, and a patriot who recognized suspicious behavior and took appropriate action. We should be thanking him, not questioning his loyalty." The committee's final report, portions of which were declassified years later, credited Thomas Eugene McKinley with exposing a Soviet intelligence network that had been operating undetected in Washington for at least 6 years. The report estimated that the network had compromised hundreds of classified documents across multiple government agencies. The disruption of this network was described as one of the most significant counterintelligence successes of the decade. Thomas received a commendation from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, a certificate presented in a private ceremony attended only by Thomas, Martha, Crawford, and a handful of senior FBI officials. Hoover, An imposing figure with his characteristic scowl shook Thomas's hand and told him that vigilant Americans like him were the nation's best defense against communist infiltration. Thomas, who had never met anyone so famous or powerful, mumbled his thanks and tried not to stare. But the recognition came with a price. Thomas could no longer work at the Federal Communications Commission. The publicity, though most details remained classified, made it impossible for him to maintain the anonymity necessary for his job. Too many people knew his face, knew his story. He was transferred to a Veterans Affairs hospital in Maryland, where he resumed custodial work in a setting where his newfound notoriety was less problematic. The transfer meant a longer commute and slightly lower pay, but it also meant relative safety. The FBI's surveillance of Dmitry Volkov had revealed no evidence of retaliation plans against Thomas or his family. Volkov himself was declared persona non grata by the State Department and ordered to leave the United States within 72 hours. He returned to Moscow, where his career likely ended in disgrace, having lost an entire network of agents due to what he had dismissively called an insignificant janitor. Viktor Petrov pleaded guilty to espionage charges in 1959 and was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. His cooperation with American counterintelligence led to the identification and arrest of 4 additional Soviet agents in the Washington area. The other 3 members of his network fled the country before they could be apprehended, almost certainly warned by Soviet intelligence that the operation had been compromised. Thomas returned to his quiet life, working the night shift at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, coming home to Martha and the children, trying to forget the night that had changed everything. But he could not forget, not entirely. He would sometimes pause while mopping a hallway or emptying a wastebasket and remember the weight of that moment in the warehouse, the cold calculation in Dmitry Volkov's voice, the realization that he had stumbled into something far larger than himself. Years later, after he retired in 1978, Thomas would occasionally tell the story to his grandchildren. They would gather around him in his living room, eyes wide with excitement, as he recounted following the spy through the dark streets of Washington. He would describe the warehouse, the documents, the desperate flight through the alleys. The children always wanted to know if he had been scared. Terrified, Thomas would admit. I thought they were going to catch me. I thought I might not make it home to your grandmother and your parents. But I also knew that what I had witnessed was important, that American lives might depend on someone doing something about what I had seen. So I did what I thought was right, even though I was scared. The story always ended the same way, with Thomas emphasizing that heroes were not fearless. They were simply ordinary people who chose to act when circumstances demanded action. He had been an ordinary janitor who happened to be in the right place at the right time, who had paid attention when others might have looked away, who had trusted his instincts when something felt wrong. What Thomas never told his grandchildren, what he barely admitted even to himself, was how that night had changed his understanding of his own life. For 11 years before March 14th, 1958, he had viewed himself as exactly what Dmitry Volkov had dismissively described: invisible, insignificant, someone who existed on the margins of important events. He had accepted this role, even found comfort in it. But that night had revealed a profound truth. The margins were where the most important observations often occurred. The invisible people, the custodians and clerks and laborers who kept the machinery of government running, they saw everything. They simply needed someone to recognize that what they saw mattered. The Federal Communications Commission implemented sweeping security reforms in the wake of the Petrov case. File cabinets in offices containing classified materials were required to have tamper-proof locks. Custodial staff underwent enhanced background checks and received training in recognizing suspicious behavior. Access to certain floors was restricted even at night, requiring special clearances and multiple layers of authorization. The reforms were necessary, but Thomas could not help feeling they missed the point. The real security failure had not been inadequate locks or insufficient protocols. It had been the assumption that ordinary employees like custodians were too insignificant to be good observers, too invisible to matter. Crawford stayed in touch with Thomas over the years, calling periodically to check on the family and occasionally meeting for coffee. During one such meeting in 1967, nearly a decade after the Petrov case, Crawford told Thomas something that had never been made public. The intelligence Petrov had been stealing was traced back through Soviet channels using analysis of later Soviet military communications. The information had been used to develop countermeasures against American radio surveillance in Southeast Asia, potentially compromising operations during the early escalation of the Vietnam War. If Thomas had not discovered Petrov that night, if he had simply knocked on the office door, accepted the explanation, and moved on with his work, the damage could have been substantially worse. "You saved lives," Crawford said. "American servicemen in Vietnam whose communications were not compromised, whose positions were not betrayed. You will never know their names, and they will never know yours, but you saved them. That is worth something." Thomas had never thought about it in those terms. He had been focused on the immediate drama, the chase through dark streets, the testimony and publicity. The idea that his actions had echoed forward in time, protecting soldiers he would never meet in a war that had not yet started in March 1958, that gave the whole experience a different weight. Martha, who had initially been angry about the risks Thomas had taken, gradually came to accept and even take pride in what her husband had done. She would tell her friends carefully, and without revealing classified details, that Thomas had done something important for his country. The friends would nod politely, assuming this was a wife's natural tendency to inflate her husband's accomplishments. Only Martha and Thomas knew the truth, that an ordinary janitor had stumbled into history and had been equal to the moment. The Cold War continued for another 3 decades after the Petrov case, a grinding struggle of intelligence and counterintelligence, of spies and moles and networks operating in shadows. The Soviet Union would continue to run agents in the United States, and the United States would reciprocate. Some of these agents would be caught, many would not. The espionage wars would claim lives and reputations, would distort careers and destroy families. Against this vast backdrop, the story of Thomas McKinley was a footnote, a minor success in a much larger conflict. But footnotes matter. They provide context and detail, remind us that history is not simply the story of presidents and generals, but also of ordinary people who found themselves facing extraordinary circumstances. Thomas McKinley represented all the invisible Americans who kept the country functioning during those dangerous years, who went to work each day, paid attention to their duties, and had the courage to speak up when they noticed something wrong. The custodial closet where Thomas had kept his cart and supplies at the Federal Communications Commission is gone now, renovated away during a building modernization in the 1980s. The offices where Viktor Petrov stole classified documents have been reconfigured multiple times. Their contents and purposes changed with the evolving mission of the agency. The warehouse on Water Street, where Thomas witnessed the handoff of stolen intelligence, was demolished in 1974 to make room for a condominium development. The physical spaces where these events occurred have vanished, erased by time and progress. But the lesson remains. In the great struggles between nations, in the shadow wars fought by intelligence services, the outcome often depends on individuals who happen to be paying attention at crucial moments. Thomas McKinley was not trained as a counterintelligence officer. He had no special skills in recognizing espionage. He was simply a man who knew his workplace well enough to recognize when something was out of place, who trusted his instincts enough to investigate further, and who had the moral courage to report what he had discovered, despite the obvious dangers. The file on Viktor Petrov, preserved in the FBI's archives, contains numerous documents detailing his recruitment, his activities, and his eventual capture. Buried among the surveillance reports and interrogation transcripts is a single photograph of Thomas McKinley taken during his initial interview at FBI headquarters on the morning of March 15, 1958. The photo shows a middle-aged man in work clothes, his face lined with fatigue and stress, his eyes reflecting something between confusion and determination. He looks exactly like what he was, an ordinary person thrust into circumstances he never anticipated and trying his best to do the right thing. That photograph represents something important about the Cold War and about the nature of security and vigilance. The great conflicts of the 20th century were not won solely by soldiers on battlefields or diplomats in conference rooms or scientists in laboratories. They were also won by people like Thomas McKinley, people whose names appear in no monuments and whose faces grace no postage stamps, who simply did their jobs with diligence and attention, and who recognized when the normal patterns of daily life had been disrupted by something dangerous. Thomas Eugene McKinley died in 2003 at the age of 76, having lived to see the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. His obituary in the Arlington newspaper made no mention of his role in exposing a Soviet spy ring. That information remained classified until 2008, when portions of the FBI's files were finally released. His funeral was attended by family, friends from the Veterans Affairs Hospital, where he had worked for 20 years, and one unexpected guest, a man in his 70s, who introduced himself to Thomas's children as a former FBI agent who had worked with their father long ago. The man was Richard Crawford, retired now, but still remembering the night a janitor had called the emergency line with an incredible story that turned out to be true. Crawford stood at the graveside and told Thomas's adult children something their father had never shared with them in detail, that their father had been genuinely heroic, not in the dramatic sense of battlefield valor, but in the quieter, more sustainable courage of doing what needed to be done despite fear and uncertainty. "Your father," Crawford said, "taught me something important about this work. We spend so much time focusing on recruiting the right people, training them in techniques and procedures, giving them sophisticated equipment. But sometimes the most important intelligence comes from someone who was never trained, never recruited, someone who simply paid attention and cared enough to act. Your father was that person. He made a difference." The Cold War produced many stories of espionage and betrayal, of moles and defectors, of elaborate operations spanning years and involving dozens of agents. Some of these stories became famous, inspiring books and movies. Others remained classified, known only to the intelligence professionals who studied them. The story of Thomas McKinley falls somewhere in between, not famous enough for Hollywood, but significant enough to matter, remembered by those who understand that the margins are where the most interesting observations often occur. In the end, what made Thomas McKinley's discovery possible was not luck, though timing certainly played a role. It was the same quality that had made him a good soldier in occupied Japan and a reliable custodian in Washington: attention to detail. He knew what was normal in his workplace, understood the patterns and routines, recognized when something did not fit. This kind of institutional knowledge, built up over years of careful observation, was exactly the kind of resource that intelligence agencies often overlooked in favor of more exotic sources. The irony that Dmitry Volkov had been undone by the very person he most dismissively described as insignificant was not lost on the FBI agents who studied the case. In their analysis, they noted that the Soviet intelligence service's contempt for ordinary American workers had created a blind spot in their operational security. They had assumed that custodians, clerks, and other support staff were essentially invisible, too unimportant to pay attention to their activities. This assumption had cost them an entire network. American counterintelligence drew lessons from this, though whether these lessons were consistently applied is debatable. The value of human observation, particularly by people who knew their environments intimately, was emphasized in training materials. But organizations, like individuals, often revert to their comfortable assumptions. The idea that the most valuable intelligence might come from a janitor, rather than a sophisticated technical surveillance system, was counterintuitive enough that it required constant reinforcement. Thomas himself never claimed to have done anything extraordinary. When pressed in the few interviews he gave after portions of the story were declassified, he would insist he had simply been doing his job. "A good custodian pays attention," he would say. "You notice when things are out of place, when someone is somewhere they should not be, when the normal routine has been disrupted. I was just being a good custodian." This humility was genuine, but it also obscured something important. Paying attention requires more than just passive observation. It requires engagement with one's environment, curiosity about why things are the way they are, and willingness to investigate when something seems wrong. Thomas had all of these qualities. He had never been content to simply go through the motions of his work, collecting his paycheck and going home. He took pride in knowing his building, understanding its rhythms, recognizing its patterns. This pride, this professional engagement with work that others might have viewed as menial, was what enabled him to recognize that Viktor Petrov's presence in Douglas Reeves's office was not just unusual, but wrong. The broader implications of the Petrov case extended beyond the immediate damage control and network disruption. It prompted a re-evaluation of how Soviet intelligence services were operating in the United States. The KGB and GRU had traditionally relied on deeply embedded agents, people who had spent years establishing their credentials and gaining access to sensitive information. Petrov represented a newer approach, the lateral recruit, someone already in place within a target organization who could be turned through ideological appeal or financial inducement. This approach was potentially more vulnerable to detection, but also allowed for quicker access to current intelligence. The FBI's counterintelligence division used the Petrov case as a teaching example for decades. New agents studied the timeline, the initial discovery, the successful interdiction of the intelligence transfer. They analyzed what had gone right, Thomas's decision to investigate rather than ignore the anomaly, his presence of mind to follow Petrov rather than immediately report, his detailed observation of the meeting in the warehouse. They also studied what had nearly gone wrong, Thomas's considerable luck in escaping the warehouse undetected, the risk he had taken in following a potential spy without backup or training, the possibility that Petrov and Volkov might have successfully fled before they could be identified. The case became shorthand within the counterintelligence community for a particular kind of success, the accidental observation that disrupts a planned operation. Intelligence professionals called it the McKinley effect, the phenomenon where someone outside the intelligence apparatus, through simple vigilance and common sense, provides critical information that trained professionals have missed. The term was never official, never appeared in formal reports, but it persisted in the informal language of counterintelligence work. For Thomas, the years after 1958 were marked by a gradual return to normalcy. The FBI protection detail was withdrawn after 6 months when it became clear that no retaliation was forthcoming. The family settled into life in Maryland, where the longer commute was balanced by a larger house and better schools. Martha went back to work part-time as a secretary, adding to the family income. The children grew up, went to college, started careers. Life continued in the ordinary rhythms that Thomas had always preferred, but something had changed, something subtle but permanent. Thomas carried with him the knowledge that he had mattered, that in one crucial moment his observations and actions had made a difference. This knowledge colored how he approached his work, his family, his community. He paid attention differently, engaged more fully, trusted his instincts more readily. He had learned that ordinary people in ordinary circumstances could still be important, could still contribute to something larger than themselves. It was a lesson that shaped the rest of his life, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.